Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And this time, I'm going to be talking to you about desktop tab panels and page panels. So why use these panels in your apps? Well, they let you organize the user interface that you present to the user. And they do this by only showing the controls, thus the user interface, that is relevant for whatever the user happens to be doing at that moment. So a bit about tab panels. They provide a visual way for the user to switch which controls are visible on the user interface. And that visual way is something that's called a tab. I'm sure you've seen it in many, many types of apps. You can read in the user guide more about tab panel here. And you can set up tab panels directly in the layout editor, which is pretty convenient. You can add or remove tabs at runtime as well. So you don't have to just stick with whatever fixed amount of tabs you added when you designed your layout. Page panels, very similar to tab panels. In fact, tab panel inherits from the page panel control. The big difference is that a page panel doesn't actually provide a UI to switch between the different panels or pages that it contains. So you have to provide some way to do that yourself. So you switch programmatically and you have some other control or some other part of the UI or some action that tells the page panel to show a different page. You can read more about page panels here in the user guide. And they also are set up in the layout editor, pretty similar to tab panels. You can, of course, add or remove pages at runtime. And the last one I want to mention is container controls, because this works great with these two types of panels. So container controls in general are a great way to help you keep your UI design organized within your project. The user doesn't know that you've used container controls. They're invisible collections of controls. But for working on your layouts and whatnot, a container control can really help keep things neater. For example, if you do have a window that's got a lot of controls on it, and say it has a bunch of tabs, you could end up with a window with, hundreds of controls organized throughout, multiple tabs. But in the control list in the navigator, it'll just be a big long list of controls. You won't have any way to know which tab they're particularly on. And that also makes your window much, much larger than it really needs to be. You have to scroll around more. You've got more code on there that maybe isn't really directly related to other pieces of code that's on there. So by using container controls, you can, kind of keep each section of the UI in its own little container. And then you can just drop those on the pages of the two panels. You can read more about container controls here. They're also on that page some links to videos and stuff, because I have covered container controls in videos in the past. And like I mentioned, you can put a single container control on each tab or page, and it's much, much more manageable. It's a much better design. And everything is easier when it's simpler. So, by simplifying your window layout, everything's faster. The user interface is faster. Your coding and programming is probably going to be faster as well. And you can also even add container controls at runtime, which is a neat way to swap in or even just display something rapidly that is more dynamic and isn't fixed based on the layout. All right, so let's switch over to Xojo and take a look at these two things. So here we've got Xojo window. And you can see all the controls that are available to you. And right down here, this is the page panel, and this is the tab panel. I'll just start with a tab panel real quick. Drag it up here, you know, and you can resize it and position it just like anything else. You could lock it to the edges if we wanted. You can see the properties for the tab. There's not really a whole lot of properties you need to worry about. The most important one is this edit button that lets you edit the panels that are within the tab. So if I click that, you get a drop-down dialog here, sheet dialog on Mac, and it has an entry for each tab that's on there now. I can click on it to rename the tab. And I can add a new tab if I want. And then when I do that, it shows up here. I can click on the individual tabs. It doesn't really do anything now since I haven't put any controls anywhere. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say on the overview tab, I'm just going to put a list box in here. And so we can easily identify it as a list box. I'll make sure the headings show. And then you see when I switch to another tab, that list box is no longer visible. So there's nothing yet on this details tab, so it shows as blank. So we can put something here. So this could be some bunch of fields. And then the notes tab also has nothing yet. And I can add here, say, a text area. So they're now, from a user interface standpoint, these are all independent of each other. If you're on the details tab, you're not going to see the other controls. From the Windows standpoint, they're not independent at all. You can see they're all listed here. You can't easily tell which tab they're on just by looking at the list. However, if you do click on one of them, it will switch you to the tab where it exists. So if you run the project, you can see that it works how we expect and how the layout editor preview was showing you things. So all nice and dandy. And again, this is a great way to organize things. You don't necessarily want to have a single window that has everything on it and is too overwhelming for a user to figure out and understand. So kind of hiding things behind tabs is a concept people are very familiar with these days and is worth doing. Now, tab panel is very similar. I'm actually going to just throw that off to the side because I'm going to drag the controls off of it. And I'll take a tab panel here and we'll just put it on here. Now you can already see this looks a little bit different in the layout editor. There's no actual tabs, of course, and there's this odd little control here at the bottom. If I switch to the inspector, however, it looks very similar. Still has the panels edit button, which lets me add panels. I can't rename them because the names aren't visible anyway. They're just there to let you know how many there are, but I can add a new page. So this would now have 3, and I'm essentially going to mimic the tab design I did up here. I can use these arrows to move between the tabs, and there's also a direct go-to to jump to a specific page. I often will refer to these things as tabs, even though they're pages. And I can just move over the controls I have here onto the appropriate panels. And I don't know if you noticed, but whoops, I accidentally right-clicked there. I want to put that one back. Get that there. When I drag the control here, you can see the outline of the panel. It turns reddish. That indicates that it's actually kind of grabbed hold of this control, and it's now its parent, so it will only appear there. All right, so I got everything out of this older tab panel, so I'm just going to delete that. So now, if I use the arrows here, you can see panel 0 has our list box, panel 1 has the field, and 2 has the text area. So that's the same layout I had used for the tab. If I run this, however, we're only going to see the list box here, as that's tab 0. That's the default tab we have showing. default page, I guess. And there's no way to switch to any of the other ones. So we have to put something in place to do that. And you can use whatever control works for your layout. Pop-up menu certainly could work. I could even make these have the same names we used for the tabs. And then I can put code in the pop-up menu. To switch the page. Now, technically, I put them in the same order as the pages, so this will seem a little bit redundant. But they may not always match up, and they certainly don't need to. The order of the panels is irrelevant as long as you know which panel is what. You can just switch to them. One technique I'll often use is create constants for what's on the panel. So I probably would create a constant called, K overview, K details, K notes, and then I would refer to that here so I know exactly which panel I think I'm displaying with this code. So this is just saying if you pick the first item in the list box, show the first panel item. And I could, of course, written that a lot simpler in this very simple case of writing something like this. But that, like I said, will easily break if you want to show your panels, and your panel, that'll break if your panels are not in the exact same order as the pop-up menu. So here now I've got a control up here, and I can choose it, and then now switch the pages of the panel based on what we select in the pop-up menu. So that's good. You can use a toolbar, segmented control, whatever makes sense for that sort of thing. Now, the other thing I mentioned is the use of container controls. You can add a container control to your project. And essentially, container control is just a collection of controls. So say I wanted to make this container control be, the details one, which theoretically might have, a bunch of fields on it. So it'll be a little bit more complicated. Now I can go back to the panel that has that details information there, and I can get rid of these individual controls, and I could just drag the container control right in here. And make it sized appropriately. So now these controls are going to show up when we run it and display that panel. And what's nice is that none of this stuff is actually on the window. There's just a single container control. There's not, essentially, in this case, it would be 4 more controls you see on the list here. And if this container, if there were actually a lot of items here on this details area that you wanted, they would all show up in your control list. And, maybe that starts to make things harder for you to work with. So putting it in a container like this, it's a nice way to categorize that and organize that. And again, the user doesn't know any differently. It's more of an internal design of your project. Now, the last thing you can do with a container that is cool is you can actually add it at runtime. So if we get rid of this note container or note text area that we have on the note panel, I can create another container control. And I can put something on it. I'll put the text area back on it. And what I can do is I can add that at runtime rather than dragging the container in here. And it would probably make sense to add it when the note panel is selected in the pop-up menu. So I could come right here to this code here, which is selecting the note panel. And I probably want to make sure that I don't create a new container every time. So I can put a property on the page here. And then I can check to see if it's nil. So that'll just create one and keep reusing that one. And then I can embed it directly within a particular panel by calling the embed within panel method. And I hover over this, you can see at the bottom, it's various arguments that it takes. So you have to tell it what the containing panel is. That's going to be our page panel 1. And then which page we want it on. And in this case, that'll be page 2, and then where you want this thing to display within the page. We want it on page panel 2, and we can just display it in the top left corner. So now this will add it at runtime. So like I said, we don't have anything here on the notes panel. That's panel 2. So nothing in the layout editor, but if I come over here to notes, it's now added at runtime. And that's super useful if your number of panels changes. So if you were, say, adding new panels at runtime, you can then use this technique to make sure that your new panels, you can add the content you want to them also at runtime. So super, super handy. All right, so what's next on your journey of tab and page panel knowledge? Well, make sure you head on over to xojo.com/download to grab the latest version of Xojo. And today, actually, Xojo 2009 Release 1 was made available. So you can grab that and check it out. Over 200 changes. Plenty of items in the release notes for you to scan. If you'd like to be notified when new videos are posted, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/GoXojo. If you're new to coding or need a refresher, check out our free Introduction to Programming book at xojo.com/learn. And of course, I like to remind everyone to take advantage of our wonderful user community by heading to the Xojo forum at forum.xojo.com. And here's a few helpful links to the documentation, the main documentation page, of course. And I showed these links earlier, but these are the links for the page panel, the tab panel, and the container control topics in the user guide. All right, if you ever have questions on this topic or anything Xojo related, you can reach me via email, paul@xojo.com, or on Twitter, @LaFever, and @Xojo will reach me. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.